All right, gentlemen, we're back. I have been busy, especially on Sundays, which isn't surprising. So, flexibility in returning to another episode of the Moby Dick Book Club. As always, we have a little Discord server where we put the link out. So you can find that in the video description here. I think I might have actually not put that in there. Anyway, we'll worry about that later. I really hope you like learning about whales because today was more true facts about the whale with Captain Ishmael. Um, so let's dive into it. We've got chapter 102, a bower in the Arsachidi days. I don't know how to say that word. If you guys have any it's the name of the chapter. Nope. Okay, we'll look that up later. We've done a lot of whale anatomy chapters, and Ishmael feels like we need just a little bit more. We need to just cover the skeleton as such. And fortunately, he happens to be an expert on whale skeletons on account of his friend Tranquo, a king in a particular island somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. It doesn't matter which one too much, you know. Let's not worry about the details here. And he goes into a long description about his particular measurements of this whale skeleton, which the local king had recovered from the beach from a beached whale and had set up as a little temple with its own little priesthood to eternally have flame coming out of the spout hole, which is cool. Not going to do it in the Catholic Church, but it is cool. Like I'll respect the game there. And yeah, he gave a measurement of the whale's bones, and he had those tattooed on his arm because that was the most secure way of bringing such knowledge back to land. And his estimation was that the skeleton of the whale was something like 70 feet long, and on account of how skeletons aren't the real thing, this would have belonged to a full size male whale about 90 feet long. And he had all the measurements tattooed on his arm.
Yeah, this is have not laughed so much so far in the book. These chapters are just
I actually did
gold.
like do a little laugh out loud when he talked about tattooing it on his arm. I was like, just
Oh no,
ridiculous.
I laughed out loud like 10 times reading this reading. Yeah. Just some stuff I was just like, this is gold. This is comedy gold. Yeah, I mean the interesting thing to me is it's not so much that he tattoos it on his arm because that's already absurd. But he says he kind of squishes it together because he needed to leave room for a poem he was working on. I was just like, what is this book? Why is this like this? How can anybody read this? This is too much. I mean, the whole idea that he's gonna leave space for his poem. And it's great because every time he starts talking about what we would deem as one of the sciences, he really is just absolutely mercilessly mocking them. Which I gotta say, nothing brings me more joy in this world. Didn't used to be that way, but now, yes. Um, yeah, and you know, he does he pulls the trick again, right? I mean, he basically says um, like the way it opens, right? You know, when he's talking about this stuff, it's always so, you know, it's so
Grandiose. Yeah.
aggrandizing. You know, he's always appealing in these sections to yeah, like, but how Ishmael, how is it that you, a mere oarsman in you know, in the fishery, pretend to know aught about the subterranean parts of the whale, right? And then he goes on this fantasy about different ways that would have happened. And then he starts making his claims about, well, there was a baby whale and I took that apart with my knife and my axe. and then he's talking about his buddy
Yeah.
with the island, and that is I guess it's subgroup of islands or whatever. I don't know how they did do that or how they did that back then because it's changed,
Mhm.
right? But that's part of the Solomon Island chain out there,
Okay.
in upside down land near Australia.
Mhm.
That's what that is. Because I had never. I'm like, what is? I mean, there's the Pacific. I've heard of like four things in the Pacific Ocean, and there's
What do
like
you have to do with the Pacific Ocean? Why do you need to know those islands? You're not a general trying to defeat the Japanese. You would learn those islands very quickly.
right, right. Well, and I'm far away from it. It's not, you know. So it's like I don't know. That's a far away ocean. Like that's a really far away ocean. So yeah, I've only seen it a handful of times. So beautiful ocean to be sure, but uh, other than the ones right off the coast of L.A. there that you see coming into the airport, didn't see a single island in the Pacific Ocean yet. So there you go.
Maybe someday when your ship comes in, we can go on a Pacific
When
Island
my ship
cruise.
comes in, we'll go on a Pacific. And all the chapters here are like that right at the beginning, where he's justifying the claims he's about to make. Um, Yeah, I mean, they just get more outlandish as as the chapters go on.
I was having a lot of fun with this one, and I mean, it's just, I mean, even just the first page. So he talks about, oh, like that now he has to unbutton the whale even further. He says even unbuttoning his garters down and like unbuttoning him down to his skeleton, which is just such a ridiculous set of imagery. But yeah, just that where he goes and he even goes and there's always this move of like, oh, how could I possibly speak on this? And then he goes and like re-legitimizes himself using like putting words in your mouth, the reader. So he goes to he even says right here, he's like, a veritable witness have you hitherto been, Ishmael? It's just like
Right,
I'm
right.
not saying that.
Which, if you remember that chapter where he was talking to the guys in Ecuador, it's
Yeah,
exactly the way those guys
right.
were talking to him.
Yeah, yeah,
Please,
exactly.
senor, tell me more.
Yeah, but now it's us. Which is
Right.
just so insane. And then, yeah, just that thing that, oh yeah, he started doing science on the boat when they got the young whale, and of course, just hindering the entire process as he's going there doing his measurements and stuff on this dead whale. And then, and then the fact that he had to sneak in to get the measurements of the skeleton on the island as well. Like he
Because the
actually,
priest didn't want him to. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So he's like there, just like scribbling on his arms and doing all these things, and just oh my goodness, everything about it, just him like complaining about the worship skeleton being a gigantic idler, and it's like clearly this is just like a dead skeleton, but I don't know. I had a lot of fun with it, and then just that where he compresses the measurement because he wants more room for other stuff, but literally he's talking about like the importance of accurate measurements. And then he did them, but then he didn't actually record them because he needed space for more important things.
Well, he took the inches off. He only measured
Right.
it to the nearest foot. And it's like, well, what are these
Yeah.
inches when we're talking about the mighty whale? Which,
Yeah.
hey, it's something scientists actually do all the time, right? Like
Right.
the roundings that cosmologists use are like on orders of magnitude. It's like, you know, like we could either round this up, which would be, like 1,000 times the size of the solar system. We could round it down. It really won't matter for our measurements. It's like, yeah, okay, he's just being a good scientist when he does that rounding, apparently.
Well, and that I mean, that's what all of these chapters when he does this are meant to demonstrate. Like they really are just taking the piss out of science, basically, and saying, "Look at these science clowns." And the other was a more interesting part of this for me was the priests catch him, and they're like, "How dare you try to measure our God?" And like it's such a critique, a scathing critique of what science is doing, and because there's that indication in there about well, he's inside the creation, the whale, right? And the whale is the creator because the whale is the god for the island. And now he's measuring the creator's creation in some sense, and they're mad. And it's like,
Hmm.
how interesting, right?
Hmm.
And there's no resolution to this other than to say basically scientists claim precision, but they're actually quite sloppy. Thank you very much. And oh, by the way, their authority is all self-derived, just as mine is. Right. And so he's really ripping science apart and at the same time exemplifying, well, if you reduce your God down to a bunch of measurements, what do you have left? Right. So he's also critiquing the what I would call it the age of gnosis, because this would probably be right around the beginning of the age of gnosis, actually, approach to the world, where you are trying to reduce it all to scientisms, basically. And we'll see more of that later too. It just gets better. His critiques get better as time goes on. That's for sure.
Now we've got this section in the middle of the chapter where he starts looking at the ivy and the different tropical vines growing up the rib cage of this whale skeleton, and then he's got this whole section, and it really it kind of it's like a meditation on providence, you know.
Yep.
Oh, busy weaver, unseen weaver, pause, one word, whither flows the fabric, and it goes on for quite a while, right? So you've got like this really, absurd kind of comical story about measuring the skeletons of the whale. And then you've got like this bit right in the middle, ah, mortal, then be heedful, for all in the din of this great world's loom, thy subtlest thinkings may be overheard afar, and like how you can't hear it was there was this bit about the factory, in the factory where they're looming all of the things together. The machinery was extremely loud in those days. I bet you it's still pretty loud, and you can't
It
hear
is.
anything but I guess if somebody's yelling inside of a loud room and the window's open, it's more audible outside. That's what he claims anyway.
Yep.
So there's
It's
just something wild there.
it's interesting because I think this came up a little bit in our book club yesterday. This aspect of like weaving, but also like a very sort of intricate background or like a tree line or something like that, being able to obscure kind of imperfections versus having like a very plain environment, and then you see the impurities a whole lot easier. So there is a sort of like loudness, I guess you could say, from all of the vines and everything kind of overgrowing the stuff. So I did think that was really interesting.
But also there he's he's contrasting the science and religion and show how they interrelate. And he basically already did that. What takes priority to him? His poem or his measurements? Right. What's more important ultimately? Right. And I mean, you could get cynical about it and say, well, it's his poem and he wants, but he's making a larger point. The larger point is, no. To all men, what is more important is story. It's like that's what's more important, not measurement. We're going to compress the measurement for the sake of the story, right? To save the story, and so it's a scathing critique, and the fact that he bounces into effectively what would you call this? An inside creation story about weaving. I mean, none of this is accidental. It's amazing, but it's not accidental. And the quality of the critique, I think, is probably certainly at the time, which was too high-minded, which is why the book didn't catch on right away. It was too far ahead of its time, right? It's everybody else who's going, oh yeah, now we see the pattern, right? Because Melville saw it early, and people who were stuck in it didn't quite see it. Now it's
Early adopters always get hosed.
Yeah.
Happens with technology, happens with people who are writing ahead of their time.
Yep.
Just get used to it.
Yeah. Well, the prophet in his own land is, not well received, we'll say.
There's I really like this bit where right before he presents the everything, he goes and he says, he said, but first be it recorded that in this matter, I am not free to utter any fancied measurement I please, because there are skeleton authorities you could refer to test my accuracy. And then he goes and he lists off like two major ones. And the second one he lists, the Sir Clifford, says he thinks of charging 2 pence for a peep at the whispering gallery in the spinal column, 3 pence to hear the echo in the hollow of his cerebellum, and 6 pence for the unrivaled view from his forehead. And it's like, yep. There it is.
You know what? I'd probably that sounds like a decent deal. I'd do that.
Yeah.
I paid like $5 to see a 2,000 pound steer once, so
Yeah.
or it was like 2,700 pounds, something crazy. It was huge. That was a big stinking animal. It was just kind of sitting there.
Hmm.
Yeah, he mentions. Is it in this chapter? He mentions the museum, or is that the next one? He mentions
Uh,
two museums.
yeah, it's on the page after the skeleton authorities.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just funny that he. But there's proper science, the ability to validate outside the person telling you, right? Like that's why the replication crisis in science is so important, right? Because basically says you're not doing proper science until somebody else does it too. Until there's two papers on the same thing using the exact same methodology, you don't have a finding. What you have is a fantasy.
Yep, and that's why science is hard. If you're going to do it properly, if you're going to do bad like pseudoscience, that's super easy. I could do that 5 times in a day, but
Yeah, me
proper
too.
stuff is a little more difficult. You got to be a math nerd for that, and who has time for that? We're too
Exactly.
busy writing a poem that we're going to tattoo on our right arm. All right. Well, chapter 103 is an awful lot of the same sort of thing where he goes into the actual measurements. I got that in a little bit early there. Apparently the largest of the whale's middle vertebrae is about 8 feet tall. Um, yeah, so it's a pretty like rough estimate. You know, we're not getting down to like inches, and we're not getting the sort of measurements that would allow you to it to recreate a model of this skeleton. But it's actually useful enough for the story because it gives you some sense of the bulk of the animals. Like I could stand up all the way inside of the body cavity of a full grown whale and not hit my head on the top. And there's quite a bit of blubber and flesh on the outside of it. So it gives you a scale of like how crazy these guys were to go out into a tiny little boat and start throwing harpoons at these things when like the appropriate stance I think is just to watch from about, I don't know, 500 yards away with a good pair of binoculars.
Hmm.
Unless you're in a really big boat, then you might be able to get close, but it should be a really big boat.
Yeah, and they are quite beautiful. If you haven't been on a whale watch, highly recommend. Yeah, they're quite pretty. Don't get too close. Somebody actually got whacked on a boat recently in the New England area. One of the interesting things about this particular chapter, though, is the I think it's towards the yeah, it's towards the end. How vain and foolish then I thought for timid, untraveled man to try to comprehend aright this wondrous whale by merely poring over his dead, attenuated skeleton stretched in this peaceful wood. Not only, no, only in the heart of the quickest perils, only when the eddies of his angry flukes, only on the profound, unbounded sea can the fully vested whale be truly and livingly found out. So, this is sort of like a statement about the difference between dissection and observing a live animal, and how the two basically, effectively, what he's saying is they have almost no crossover, effectively, right? Like the majesty of a living being is nothing compared to what you can get out of it once it's been dissected. And then he goes on to compare, what the spine would look like in different configurations, and but then he ends with this idea. Thus, we see that the spine of even the hugest living thing tapers off at last into simple child's play. I just thought that was great. As if the material determined the weight or significance of what was being measured, which, of course, it doesn't do anything like that. So I found that, again, most delightful as a nice little critique of measurement and science in general.
Yeah, and the priest's children had stolen the last few murder blades to play marbles with them.
Yeah,
So it's like
the cannibal urchins.
cannibal urchin. Oh boy, that Melville, he sure's got away with words.
That was almost my subtitle for today. But yeah, those were the same only like highlights that I really had from this one. But yeah, it just kind of calls to mind. I mean, there was a thing that you said yesterday, Mark, or this thing of like, oh, you only know someone when you fought them, and it's just
Yeah.
like this exactly right. Like just actually being able to have that participation. It's like, oh, like you really do actually you can you can really put like the movement and the intentionality and their playfulness, or even just kind of the seriousness of like, oh, I'm actually fighting this person for for keeps or for more than that, and it's like there is really something there. So, but I mean, clearly this guy has a quality of relationship with whales. I mean, if the folks at home haven't figured that out yet.
More of a quality relationship with whales than I do. We don't. Well, whales mean something different out here in the middle of North America. Chapter 104, the fossil whale. So again, like I said, if you weren't excited to hear more about whales, this is not the book for you. Starts to talk about different measurements of whales, and he goes into this whole thing about how big it is and how he has to use really big words to describe how big these whales are, and how he's got to reference Dr. Johnson's dictionary in that, and then there's this bit about all of the archaeology, and archaeology I think was becoming a serious science at this time, and like all serious science it started off extremely certain in this age, and then I think as people have gotten more and more knowledge about it, they're a little bit more and more speculative about it. I remember when I was on the pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 2018. We toured Megiddo, also known as Armageddon, because it's a real town. And we got a tour. It wasn't our normal tour guide. They brought in this Austrian archaeologist, and he talked about how some of the early digs in like the early part of the 20th century, he thought, the consensus was that those guys moved way too fast and weren't nearly careful enough with what they were doing. And, like the science was in its early stages, and it hadn't figured out like the best way to make sure you preserve all this detail and measurement there. But yeah, something like Megiddo was rebuilt, 27 times or something crazy like that. So it's an archaeologist's dream to go down all those layers. Yeah, and he goes into all of the different whale fossils that have been recovered. Um, I really appreciate the fact that the most wonderful of all the cetacean relics was the almost complete vast skeleton of an extinct monster found in the year 1842 on the plantation of Judge Cree in Alabama.
Yeah,
It's just like, oh, Alabama, okay. You don't think of archaeological digs in Alabama in the same sentence. For any of our European listeners who might be listening, it's not usually your first association.
Nope. It's not the pinnacle of high society.
I was just having fun with just the language that he was using on this one. I mean, because he just talked about unbuttoning the whale down to a skeleton, and now he's saying, since I've undertaken to manhandle this leviathan, it behooves me to approve myself omnisciently exhaustive in the enterprise. And then he goes, and he's like using all these extremely like overdone words. Even habitatory, I think he coined. Like I haven't seen any other use of that before. fossiliferous is definitely extremely rare. And then goes and he says the unwarrantably grandiloquent, but then he goes and he talks about that there was an edition of of the dictionary. He said that even the lexicographer's uncommon personal book fitted him to compile a lexicon to be used by a whale author like me. So it's just this thing of like, the books are large, the measurements are large, even the guy who made the thing was large. Like this is what we're doing. And he says, give me a condor's quill, give me Vesuvius's crater for an inkstand. Friends, hold my arms. It's just so dramatic.
It's good. But my favorite part is when he presents his credentials as a geologist by stating that in my miscellaneous time, I have been a stone mason and also a great digger of ditches, canals, and wells, wine vaults, cellars, and cisterns of all sorts. And I did, like, if you didn't laugh out loud at that, I mean, the problem with these chapters is I barely finished in time because there were so many interruptions from belly laughter and the absurdity. It's like watching Spinal Tap, right? The absurdity is dialed up to 11. It's just genius.
Even the line just above that too, where he says, "No great and enduring volume can ever be written on the fleet, though many there be who have tried it."
I thought that was probably him sniping at authors who write smaller texts, right? I don't know, but yeah, I mean, there's so many good. Yeah, the whole thing about Vesuvius Inkwell and Hold My Arms. The whole thing. Like, yeah, this chapter took forever to read. I was way too busy laughing.
Oh my goodness.
But again, it's an indictment to your earlier point, Father. Like, archaeology is kind of sloppy, and archaeology varies a lot. So, like, one thing I found out. When they dig in England or in the UK, they just basically don't pay attention to any layers until you get into the 1400s. So all the layers that would help you understand what was going on in England at the time of the founding of the United States basically are not archaeology to them. They don't care. And to us, this is our oldest stuff. It's our most important time period because there's nothing before that we really care about. I mean, there's some Indian mounds in Louisiana and Alabama and Georgia and one here in South Carolina, I guess, too. But like, most of what we're looking for is from a time period that the people, the Brits just throw away. Like, that's not important. Get rid of it.
Yeah. The American relationship to time is a little bit different than the European relationship to time because, when you could trace your civilization back to the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, it's like, well, that's quite a bit longer than George Washington by several orders of magnitude.
I was born in Troy. Thank you. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Yeah, and he points out that there's all these problems in geology and in archaeology where they've already had to redo stuff, right? They've already had to uncertain the things they were certain about. So I really appreciated that too.
This is one of those things I kind of think about with respect to like when they do the carbon dating and stuff. It's like it's actually really easy to flub your carbon dating stuff, and especially if you have to also like carbon date it if you're going to do that right after you dig it, because if there's airplanes flying over and all that stuff, like if that's exposed, like you could plant, if you planted like 2 new trees and like one was in like rural Montana and the other one's by like the Los Angeles International Airport, and you wait 10 years for those trees to grow up and then you carbon date them, like one's going to be accurate and one's going to be off by thousands of years. And like that's just, so it's like you got to be very careful about that stuff.
Well, I mean, trying to use isotope of carbon to tell time is already pretty bold. Not saying you can't do it. Maybe if you're really good, you can manage it. But like the things that you're measuring are infinitesimal.
Hmm.
Not
You gotta
just the
hope that
carbon, the particular isotope of carbon, and how far into its half-life have we gotten?
it's not interacting with anything else. Right?
Yeah.
Like, 'cause
Right.
that's the only factor, and also you're not in a lab. But I like this line that Ahab's harpoon had shed older blood than the pharaohs. And so there is also that kind of mixing as well, where it's just like, oh, all that historical stuff. Like, we're dealing with even older stuff now. It's like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, he does try to tie it back. You know, I think he does this implicitly most of the time, and every once in a while explicitly to show you like how this is done.
Hmm.
All right. More whale bones. This time we're digging into a little bit of more ancient history. Pliny the Elder recorded an 800-foot whale, and apparently Captain Cook recorded a site of a 360-foot whale. And we get into the midst of an argument here. Are these ancient accounts accurate and whales have been shrinking? Because the archaeological digs for the older whale skeletons um, are comparable to what whalemen are pulling out of the Pacific Ocean these days. Um,
Right.
and then there's all this stuff about the eternal whales. And there's some stuff in there that might not actually be true about their inability to fish them to extinction. And I think the main thing he might not have known about, or maybe he knew about and just didn't want Ishmael to say, because who are we talking to here, is the long gestation periods of whales and the long time it takes for them to grow to maturity.
Yeah, I think again there though, what he's actually doing is showing you that science is complete garbage because he makes it a completely invalid comparison, right? He's comparing it to the number of buffalo killed by the number of men that are out there. And so he's doing this very flat,
Mhm.
very presumptuous measurement that I actually don't think is wrong. I think those numbers are actually roughly correct, but or at least the scale is correct. Um, but there's so much that doesn't account for, right? Like gestation period, right? Or number of hunting and raiding parties. That might be, you know what I mean? Like it takes 50 men to, let's say it takes 150 men to take down a whale, right? But they can do 40 whales a journey and it takes 3 years. Well, yeah, but there's 100 of them and there's only one group of people hunting buffaloes. Guess who wins? It's not the buffaloes anymore, right? And so that's another way in which it can be wrong. And of course, duration of this activity, right? And of course, at that point, like the there were now few enough buffalo on the range, and everybody knew that, but that's what enabled the settlement. And so settlement in that area was impossible because there were so many buffalo. Right? And people don't account for that. It's like, no, you don't understand. So there were no trees, but there were a lot of buffalo and
Mhm.
and other things, but like a hell of a lot of buffalo.
If buffalo are anything like cows, they'll eat trees before they can get grown. A friend of mine owns property that he's trying to recover that had been, it's got hills on it, and it had been used for grazing pasture, and all of the little trees would constantly get eaten down by the herds of cattle that would be out there grazing. And the person who
Right.
people owned the land before were grazing cattle, so they didn't care about getting new trees grown, but he wants a habitat for deer so we can shoot them and eat them. So he's quite concerned about that, and he's had the land for maybe a decade now, probably a little less actually. And in one of the low parts, the poplar trees are just popping right up because they're not getting eaten down anymore. The fence is
Right.
doing its job, and the deer aren't quite as aggressive on trees as cows are, I think. So
Right. Well, they also get trampled, and yeah, and that section of the land, contrary to what really stupid people believe, and boy, there's a lot of really stupid people. There were never trees in the Midwest. That didn't happen. There was a big glacier, and that was the end
What
of
are you
that.
talking about, Mark? There's a pretty girl behind every tree in North Dakota.
I have heard that statement. Yes, and having been out that way, I believe it's true. I can tell you that. Uh, it's ironic that that's exactly the way they intended to say it too. They know what they were talking about. The joke's on you. Yeah. Um, i- I think again, he knows this. Like everyone's aware by that point that the buffalo are pretty much like people are concerned about the buffalo, right? There's already conservation efforts going on in the U.S. because of this problem. So, I mean, he's poking a bit of fun at the science of measurement and the fact that, well, look, you can come up with a measurement, a way to measure this that justifies what we're doing. But I'm sure, and this is at the height of the whaling, that they saw this coming. And I don't think it's a situation. So there is a situation. Jordan Peterson talks about this, where they said there's so many fish in the ocean that you could never outfish the ocean. And of course, that just it's an absurd statement based on a bunch of averages and uh, invalid measurements and ways of thinking about the world linearly that don't apply, right? Because, for example, different species have different depths at which they operate. And if you measure them where they are, the density that you're measuring is really high. And if you don't know that they're in those depths and in those water temperatures and in those currents, because if the current gets too high, they can't be there either. Uh, if you don't exclude all that and you start measuring, say, the whole Atlantic Ocean, or even just the whole of the western part of the Atlantic Ocean, you're going to come up with numbers that are so wrong you shouldn't have measured them to begin with. Technically, like that's and they obviously they didn't understand this at the time because it's early days, and so yeah, they made all of these mistakes that Melville's kind of pointing out way back then, which we still have, by the way. If you ever look up p-value hacking, you can see that scientists are still, although that's a little bit more malicious in some cases. Not some people do things because they're stupid and they fall for it, but there's a lot of people who know exactly what they're doing with p-value hacking, and it's not good. Like they're
Damned
not good.
lies and statistics.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, when they were doing it to measure like cod and stuff, they're not lying. They're deliberately. P-value hacking. It's a whole. They know what they're doing, and they know what they're doing is bad and wrong, but they're doing it anyway. But I mean, it's fine. They'll get away with it because nobody wants to punish anyone for anything right now, so it's fine.
I thought it was interesting that he was kind of talking about this thing with like the degeneration of different species like over time, and this sort of thing that he's talking about. Oh, the reported sizes of some of the things, but then also kind of going through that thing of like, well, you have the self-report problem as well, of like people just like, oh, it was 360 feet, this whale that I saw. And it's just like, well, there is also that's a little bit in contrast with the fact of like, you can't truly know the whale unless you've actually encountered it on the sea. But also the people who encountered it on the sea are going to report like it was 360 feet, or something like that. And then talking about also, just some of the archaeological things of like, Egyptian mummies that were buried thousands of years before even Pliny was born do not measure so much in their coffins as a modern Kentuckian in his socks, which is such a silly way of measuring them. And
But more pragmatic and
right.
much more helpful.
Yeah, where it's like using feet, rather than meters or something like that. But we're measuring by Kentuckians and their socks, which I'm perfectly fine with. And I did also like the thing about describing the buffalo out on the plain, and then saying, in that same place where the overhunting had happened, now there the polite broker sells you land at $1 an inch. So there is this sort of thing of like, there's a new type of predation that's kind of settled in the same place as well. And there's this ridiculous line at the bottom of that same page that says, west when the far west in whose sunset suns still rise. And it's like, why would that have actually changed? I don't know why he even bothered to say that.
Yeah, it's
But
interesting that you would point out that, these sailors who are reporting a whale at the length of 360 feet um, would be the ones who, according to Ishmael's own theory, the ones who would actually know whales best, right? Because the skeleton doesn't tell you near as much as the living whale does, and also they still have a hard time coming to a proper, understanding of these things. Maybe that's a message for us. Couldn't be.
Couldn't be.
Couldn't be.
Who wrote the
Impossible.
book? He didn't
Yes.
know us.
Doesn't speak to my lived experience.
And then there's this good line at the end, just where he says, "Wherefore, for all these things, we account the whale immortal in his species, however perishable in his individuality as well." It was good.
Right. Well, that's another poke at this, mismeasurement, right? When you're mistaking the general for the specific or the specific for the general, which is a very common, well-known scientific bias that I don't know why people talk about bias and then they don't apply it to science, even though all biases were originally applied to science because it was supposed to be corrective lenses for the foibles and pitfalls of being in that discipline, or maybe the imperfection of humans as such. Dare I say such a bold statement, if
How
such a thing could
bold.
be true.
How bold you say that to two people who believe in original sin.
He might be the only two, though. This is what I'm getting worried about.
Oh, Mark, there are still 7,000 men in this land who have not bent the knee to the Baals. Don't worry about it.
that many. Well, then
there's
feeling real
there's
safe now, Father.
there's dozens of us.
That was a biblical reference, Mark. But you wouldn't know that, would you?
I don't know this book of what's it called again? I can never remember the name because it's just a short one-word title that makes no sense and there's no author credited. It's very, very, and it's not like there's stable cover art. A visual thinker like me, come on.
That's a new one. You've added to it. Very good.
You're welcome.
All right. Chapter 106. All right, guys, we have to leave the whale bones behind.
Oh.
Well,
there's at least
really.
one bone left.
Yeah, there's at least one bone left.
Right.
On his way off of the Samuel Enderby, Ahab, in his haste, damaged his leg. Some kind of a twisting force on it, put some kind of cracks down the line, and we get a revelation here because we get all this nonlinear storytelling that this sort of thing has actually happened before. Before they set voyage from Nantucket, the whale leg he had used had splintered and somehow wounded him near his groin. So that sounds very unpleasant, and that it was a long and unpleasant recovery for him. And then there's this inevitable sorrow. There's this whole section where Ahab or Ishmael is all talking like, all of this sorrow is going to come upon us. You can't get away from it, and even the gods carry within themselves the seeds of their own misfortune, something like that. So here we've got a section of it. The ineffaceable sad birthmark in the brow of a man is but as the stamp of sorrow in the signers, that sort of thing. What I thought was really interesting about it, and what this chapter highlighted for me, is that the very thing that Ahab hates and rejects, the very thing that he doesn't want to exist anymore, he wants to murder it. That very thing he is utterly reliant upon to stand on. He stands on it and he keeps on wounding himself on the hated thing that he has to stand upon. This, of course, is an entirely unique thing which has no relation to anything, especially contemporaneously.
Exactly. I'm gonna say, yeah, what is this wacky symbolic abstract interpretation you're doing here, Father? This is completely whack.
How could it be the case that somebody is reliant on something that they hate? That never happens.
Exactly. It couldn't. We live in a rational world, totally linear and discrete. You only rely on the things you like because you can do that. You can separate the world out the way you want, measure it however you wish, and presto bingo. This weird problem of which you speak could not possibly exist in our beautifully scientific mechanistic world. Right, Castle?
No comment. The thing that struck me right here on this first bit is that this is why Ahab was a recluse in the beginning. So it says that it was not very long prior to the Pequod sailing from Nantucket that he was found lying prone one night. So the thing that he stands on, this pillar of death, essentially replacing the natural thing, he was stake-wise smitten in the groin with it. Like it, I think it didn't actually. I think it like detached from his leg, and then he got stabbed with it or something like that, and then he was found prone, and that's why he was in the room by himself that entire time. Like that was why no one saw him the whole time, and now we know.
Yeah,
Right, and that's interesting, right? Because he's really messing with the tone of the story by doing it that way.
Yeah.
You know, in a way, he's making the initial claim lesser, but actually it makes it greater. And also in terms of chapter pacing and such not, we're getting more and more glimpses. Like we've been kind of scoped and scaled out, and now we're getting like to the meat of the matter, really, right? Like we're getting into the story,
I
right?
hope by a chapter 100 and 106 we start to get into the meat of the story here.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to. We haven't really. That's the funny part. We're still not there yet. At some point, he's going to tell something interesting again, but we've only gotten crumbs thus far.
There's I like this line here right after he kind of talked about that, right after he got cured. He said, as the most poisonous reptile of the marsh perpetuates his kind as inevitably as the sweetest songster of the grove, so equally with every felicity all miserable events do naturally beget their like. There is that also, that sort of like history echoing type of thing that we're about to see happen.
All right. Yeah. So very, very interesting chapter here. And then, Ahab's leg had been damaged, and so he needs a new one, and he calls upon maybe one of the most useful genre of people that God has ever created, carpenters. And if you've ever had the fortune of being in the company, even for a short time, with a fine carpenter, right? You find that carpenters are rarely ever just carpenters. They're also mechanics, they're also plumbers, they're also electricians, they're also engineers. If you've my uncle back when he was a little bit younger, he could build anything and he could fix anything. He's got that knack in him to just do these things. There's a funny line here in chapter 107 where he talks about the carpenters are a Swiss Army knife of a man, basically. Although they didn't have the term Swiss Army knife back then, it's a brand now, and so I'm going to use that metaphor. You just take anything out of them, but there's also this particular carpenter that he's weaving in on. You get the sense that he's basically just like an automaton that gets tasked with repairing things, but doesn't have any real agency himself. And he doesn't, he's just like, well, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to fix that, I'm going to do whatever I'm just kind of told to do. So Ahab needs a new leg. I'm just going to make a new leg because that's what people do. This, of course, never happens except on whaling boats, and people never mindlessly create things because they're told to.
Yeah, no, yeah, I like uh the way he does this chapter, right? Because he starts out in wonderment of this carpenter figure, and then he effectively starts to justify the wonder with a description, which is mostly a list of properties and functions or procedures, right? And so he turns it into a propositional uh, e- um, and procedural thing, to your point, which makes it an automaton by the end. And then at the end, he re-imbues him with uh, humanity at the very end, um, by basically saying he soliloquizes and he's a soliloquizer. I was like, well, that's fascinating. So it's almost as if for Melville, um, the ability to speak is part of the thing that takes you out of being a mere machine. Which I don't know if there's a hidden message here or how deliberate this is or any of that, but like that's the opposite of the correct message. I mean, it's important, but also wrong. Um, and I can't help note that again, if you don't know the story of Helen Keller, the larger story, like people thought if you couldn't speak, you were stupid, right? And then Helen Keller disproves all that effectively because as they teach her to communicate, they find out she's quite bright and she can write stories and everything. And it actually really shook up science at the time. Like, I mean, big time. Like, people had whole careers based on, speaking as thought, and the ability to speak is being tied into the ability to think, and the quality of your speech being tied into the quality of your thought, all of which are false, by the way. It's right. It's easy to be enchanted by Sam Harris, who's actually just wrong 90% of the things he actually says, which is weird because even I know that, and I don't have a degree, so you should probably catch him at these little lies because they're not so little. But it's all based on that thesis. So I don't know where Melville falls on that line, but he's very much in line with the day. That thought and speech are sort of unique things that imbue you with humanity or something.
There's that, and the image that I got while I was reading of this was of somebody who just unceasingly and unthinkingly does things. Maybe that's Ishmaelville projecting this onto the carpenter, which he very well could do. But sometimes you do meet people without a whole lot of recollection to them, and they just kind of work, like just kind
Right.
of just do things constantly without a whole lot of recollection. That's why the church, the Catholic Church, insists that you go to church every Sunday because it like once a week. Don't do anything useful. Sit here and be a human being in the midst of other human beings, right? So
Right.
that
Right.
folks who might have this sort of tendency towards what a utilitarian existence get forced out of it at least once a week and made to do something not useful. So that was kind of the thing that I got there. But he obviously can talk. We can hear about that in the next chapter.
Well, I agree. I mean, he does that, but again, it flows from this is the most wondrous creature on the planet into this automaton, right? And then it's really just the last paragraph of the chapter where he starts it with, yet as previously hinted, this omni-tooled, open and shut carpenter was, after all, no mere machine of an automaton. Like, he actually says that. And and then he talks about not wanting to have a common soul, but something subtle in him that did its duty, which is interesting, right? Because he's tying duty to this mechanical way of existing in the world. But again, at the very end, I mean, he flat out says in here that the cunning life principle in him, right, is this ability to speak and soliloquize while he works. And then that, yeah, that gets exemplified
in
later
the
on.
next chapter. Yeah.
Right. But I just thought the whole structure of that chapter was, I don't know, some divine inspiration, because it's like there's a lot going on there for such a small chapter. I mean, it's a tiny chapter, but the message is so well delivered and in such a very careful way. And again, like I don't know what, like, it's hard to understand without having lived in that time exactly all the things he's critiquing here, other than we'll say what's obvious to us nowadays. But there's obviously there's a lot going on here that it's very hard to sort of understand. But and maybe it is because we're right in the the first. This is the third industrial revolutions, is second in the United States, right? That's where we are, right? We're right in man is machine, or man is cog in machine. And that's effectively what we are. And the way you escape that is to being on a whaling vessel, because then you're not a cog, but you have to be lots of cogs. Right. And so he's showing that in the carpenter, right? And validating his value through the science, through the properties and the measurement, right? But then revivifying him, or re-enchanting the character at the end by talking about this soliloquy thing that he does, mangling the language yet again for his own nefarious purposes.
Castle,
Yeah,
you're muted right now if you're trying to talk.
Oh, there we go.
to keep himself awake, by the way. Sorry, Castle. Just like the last word in that chapter is awake, right? He's soliloquizing to keep himself awake. And I think by awake, he means something more like awakened or enlightened is what we might use there, right? Not like awake from sleep, also awake from sleep, but the sleep would be being an automaton, right? And so it's a deeply, it's a deep spiritual critique of the Industrial Revolution. Sorry, Castle.
No, you're fine. Well, I was just, as I was muted, I was just soliloquizing to keep myself awake. So you didn't miss anything. But no, but as I was kind of going through the chapter, some of the stuff that I was picking up is that this guy, as soon as he has like a telos, everything is just a constraint for just getting that done. So it's like, whatever it is, someone sprained their wrist, he makes a lotion. And, it's just like, the carpenter makes the lotion, don't worry about it. Or, a bird shows up on the thing. He built a cage for it, because of course, just why not, at that point. But I do love, and then he says this thing where, thus this carpenter was prepared at all points and alike indifferent and without respect in all. Teeth he accounted bits of ivory, heads he deemed but top blocks, and men themselves he lightly held for capstans. So it's just, this guy is like, he's a master mediator of it. He might actually be the most stable guy on the crew. Like, there's a good chance that, but there is something interesting about, like, he can raise any matter into, for better or worse. I mean, it's kind of like that thought experiment of like the AI that can turn anything into paper clips. Just turns everything into paper clips, where it's just like whatever he's got on hand. It's like, oh, you need an ointment, or you need like a bird cage. Well, there's a guy standing right here, so I'll make you a bird cage or something like that. And then just the Swiss Army man thing of, if you need a screwdriver, then all you had to do was open that part of him and the screw was passed. Or if you needed tweezers, just take them up by the legs and there they were, which is just so ridiculous. But I do think that this guy, I mean, for what he is, like, maybe he is, he's also kind of old, like, so he's been just doing every kind of job for decades at this point, so he's just hyper competent. So actually, what could he really get from like the people on the crew? Like, I mean, all people do to interact with him is just ask him for stuff, and then he goes and he does it. So I'm not sure. Like, I do see that this guy probably is very also, I mean, I don't want to say like apathetic per se, but he's completely detached. Like, it's just at this point he's seen tons of people die. He's probably seen the ship that he's on right now like get wrecked multiple times, and it's just like, oh, I just do the job. Like, I make the shoes, I make the ointment, I make the leg. It's just like this, it's just what we're doing.
And if you could put that kind of person towards the right final goals, then it's really nice.
Yeah.
Like I was talking about, with my uncle, he worked a number of jobs productively for his entire life until some health reasons kind of pushed him into retirement. But he would, yeah. So I'm sure whoever hired him on as their plant manager was very pleased with the work that he was doing. So it's like, with this sort of person, what kind of tasks you give them is going to make a big difference, because
Yep.
they just kind of do things, and they oftentimes do a really good job. But sit and watch real genius, right? And it's like this genius here has to be directed towards a good purpose, which leads us quite easily into another ridiculous genre shift chapter here, where we go into a play now. And it starts off with the carpenter doing his soliloquy, talking to himself. The bone dust keeps on making him sneeze. It's just a comic little part here. And then Ahab comes in, calls him. It's just man maker. That's an important theme of this chapter, right? It's almost as if Ahab considers himself to be no more refined or no different in quality than the bit of whalebone that he's been walking around on. And there's this really odd section where he's like, well, here's what you're going to do is you're going to make a man for me, just like the old Promethean god did. But we're going to make him giant. About 50 feet high, his socks, chest modeled after the Thames tunnel, then legs with roots to him to stay in one place, then arms 3 feet through the wrist, no heart at all, a brass forehead, and about a quarter of an acre of fine brains. Right? So it's like, boss, I think I can make you a peg leg, but this is all a little bit too much. But even to joke about that sort of thing just gives you an idea of what's going on inside of Ahab's head. He wants to build an image of a giant man. Maybe he's going to have people bow down and worship it. I'm not sure. And this guy's just kind of confused by it, as far as I can tell. They talk about phantom pain in an amputated limb a little bit, and yeah. And then the carpenter soliloquizes to himself, well, boy, Captain Ahab, Stubb just knows him best of all, and Stubbs always says he's queer, says nothing but that one sufficient little word, queer, which back in those days didn't have the modern connotations. So, what did you fellas think of this chapter? It was a wild genre change chapter here.
It was, I mean, this one was good fun. And I don't know. I mean, just the fact that the guy's constantly sneezing throughout the entire thing was just a good touch that he just keeps on. But I like the line there on the first page where it says, this is what an old fellow gets now for working in dead lumber. So there is, again, that kind of just like, it's all wood to me, and but yeah, like the guy is a little crazy. Like he assumes, though, he says, I must call his old mogul ship. And he says, ha, that's the heel. We're in luck. Here he comes. Or it's somebody else, that's for certain. It's like, he's just babbling at this point. And then just the craziness between the two guys. So you've got Ahab just saying completely unhinged things, like just immediately contrasting the crazy carpenter, making him look sane. Like you have the statue comment, and then you've got, what is it? He wants the carpenter to put him in a vice, and he says, "No fear, I like a good grip." Even though the guy says, "This will break bones." But yeah, just a lot of these lines are fantastic. I mean, the guy puts light in front of him, and he says, what art thou thrusting that thief catcher into my face for, man? Thrusted light is worse than presented pistols. And yeah, I mean, what was this other one? The guy keeps on sneezing, and he says, "This fellow's impious. What art thou sneezing about?" He says, "Bone is rather dusty, sir. Take the hint then, and when thou art dead, never bury thyself under living people's noses."
Noses. Yeah, completely bonkers. And it seeks, it's more contrast, right? Just to provide like, oh, he's a machine, he's an automaton, and then this completely unhinged conversation with the less than properly hinged captain, and while he's working on getting him what he requested. It's just very surprising to me that that this is in here, because all the genre switching is fascinating. But again, I think that's part of the greater critique of, we can switch from purely utilitarian descriptive ways of writing, right, into, we'll say, purely performative ways of writing, and sort of skirt in between as well, right? Like, it'd be in that middle space at the same time, just to get the point across. And I think a lot of the stuff that gets talked about, we'll say, in the book, gets brought up in different contexts over and over again in different genres, and that's probably completely planned at some point, right? It's probably part of the point of the book, is to just make the same point over and over again, a completely different frame, so that more people sort of understand it. Because, I mean, effectively, he's talking about the most important issues you could talk about. This is a very meaning crisis text.
Yeah, there's this. Where is it? Let me see. Yeah, after Ahab leaves, and there's that thing of, this guy is very queer. Smart. Mr. Starbucks says it all the time. That he says, yes, now that I think of it, here's his bedfellow. He has a stick of whale's jawbone for a wife, and then says, now for most folks, one pair of legs lasts a lifetime, and that must be because they use them mercifully, as a tender-hearted old lady uses her roly-poly old coach horses. But Ahab, he's a hard driver. Look, driven one leg to death and spavined the other one for life, and now wears out bone legs by the cord. And but I was just thinking, like, poor Ahab's wife is just like off, just never to be mentioned again. And now it's just, he's really got like a better quality of relationship with like a piece of dead wood, essentially.
Which, reminder, he hates.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So, just these next two chapters, this chapter, 108 and then 109, I think we see contrasting reactions to Ahab's unhinged behavior. So we've got the carpenter. He's a simple man. He just does his job, doesn't ask too many questions, talks to himself constantly. Then we've got Starbuck. Starbuck's in a very different position in the crew and the hierarchy of the Pequod. He's the second in charge. He's the first mate, and they notice a leak in whale oil, and like, leak in whale oil is just, you're just putting money down the drain. They hardly even need to explain that. And Ahab, when informed of these things, does not want to stop into a harbor and find the leak and fix it. He would rather just go get the whale. And instead of just being like, "Oh, okay, sir," like, Starbuck starts putting serious resistance, like, "Okay, this is too much. This is too far." And Ahab actually points a loaded musket at him, and we see that courage, which in a much earlier chapter we heard that Starbuck uses like any useful tool that he might have at his disposal. We see that courage actually come into play. He's cool as a cucumber, and says, "Let Ahab beware Ahab." It's like, hey, you don't have to worry about me, buddy, but are you looking after yourself there? And what we see kind of here is kind of the first round in this Ahab to Starbuck um, relationship that we are going to see more of in the coming chapters as the plot um, glides along at a leisurely pace, as it has this entire book. So, yeah, Ahab says, "Thou art but too good a fellow, Starbuck." Um, Almost a little bit sadly. So, yeah, yeah. This is the last chapter we're talking about today, and interesting one, I thought, to see the two different personalities at work.
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge contrast, and it does sort of exemplify what's going on. And I think it's important to explain sort of how the whale oil gets lost, right? So that the whale oil is getting lost really only one way. It's not leaking out the ship because oil and water don't mix, and so it's going to stay inside the ship. But ships take on water because they're surrounded by water, and you can't perfectly seal any boat, even a fiberglass boat, my friends. I hate to tell you, fully formed one piece fiberglass. Don't know how. Water somehow gets in. Doesn't matter what you do. And there's rain and stuff. Like there's lots of ways but those ships are made of boards. The boards are stuffed with various things, usually some cotton-like substance and some tar, right? And then they're maybe further sealed, right? But effectively, they're not entirely waterproof, and so it's expected some water to get in. And so they have bilge pumps. Well, the bilge pumps just pump out whatever liquid's in the hold. They don't much care if the liquid is oil. And so that's how they're losing oil. Like they have to pump it out the back. And apparently, once it mixes, you're kind of screwed. What are you going to do? And it's also hard to tell how much there is. I could make a good argument that there's easy ways to mitigate this problem, although maybe it was as mitigated as it needed to be. But it doesn't really help you because having the oil free floating is just not a good thing, right? Especially because you do have to be careful of the water. And so it's not like you can run around with a hold full of oil and go, oh, all is well, because then you don't know how much water you're taking on anymore. And so there's still a problem there. So I wanted to make that clear because unless you've done bilge work on a boat, which unfortunately I have, you don't really understand the dynamics, right? You really got to participate with it and say, oh, I see why this is a problem. Because even though the oil won't actually go anywhere, you still got to pump. And when you're pumping, especially with salt water, because oil mixes way better with salt water than it does with fresh water. Let me put it that way. And so it's harder to get the oil out of the water in that case.
All of this to say that this oil is a huge problem, and Starbucks shocked when Ahab's like, bah, whatever.
Yeah, he says here, he says, what we come 20,000 miles to get is worth saving, sir. But he says, so it is if we get it. And he's like, well, I was talking about the oil, that we, and that was something that I expected Ahab to not hunt for whales because he ultimately doesn't care at all, but that he's willing to let all the fruits of that just completely go away. Like he's fine with that just being for like keeping the guys busy. He never actually really like cared about bringing it back, and he even says he's let it leak. I'm all a leak myself. Leaks and leaks, not only full of leaky casks, but those leaky casks are in a leaky ship, and that's a far worse plight than the Pequods, man. Yet I don't stop to plug my leak, for who can find it in the deep loaded hole or hope to plug it, even if found in this life's howling gale. And it's just like, yeah, this guy is completely just in himself. And then he says, when he says, oh, what will the owners say? He says, oh, let them stand on Nantucket Beach and out yell the typhoons. And he says, the commander's the only real owner. And so he's like completely usurped the other guys who were just so nice to him and are literally paying for this, and it's like managing everything back at home and waiting for 3 years. And then says, my conscience is in the ship's keel. And it's just like, yeah.
Well, and there's lots of implications to all of that, right? Like One is, yeah, he reveals that he doesn't care about whales. He's not here to hunt whales at all. Totally irrelevant. There's only one goal. Everybody else is talking about something else, and so this reveals him to be the single-minded, overbearing person that we thought. When he says they might as well yell at the typhoon, he's referring to himself there, right? So, in other words, he's conflating himself with a force of nature. And of course, it's bad because it's all self-reference, leaks within leaks. This is a self-referencing way to speak, obviously, right? You're using the word and applying it to the word itself, and that just reciprocally narrows into badness, always, right? Or madness in this case too. And that it points to addiction, and right, it puts you in a position where, yeah, clearly something's wrong. Something's really wrong with Ahab's point of view, independent of all other factors. Like you say, well, vengeance is important and therefore, or something goofy, but it wouldn't fly because of the self-reference, because he's digging down on ignoring everything else, right? And until, again, how does he get out of this trap? Well, Starbuck just basically forces him to reference himself as himself. You don't need to worry about me, sir. I'm going to do what you say. But you need to worry about you. And that's what snaps him out of it. So, right. And so, in a way, the self-reference is helpful, right? When applied at the right layer, by the right sort of person, right? Under the right conditions,
in the cabin. They're in the cabin. This is just the two of them.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The conditions are very specific, right? It's not public. This is why I don't like the public therapy sessions people do on YouTube, right? Because it's quite a common thing where they're doing public therapy. These things need to be done in private. It's actually super important, especially if you're going to point out something that would potentially be embarrassing, right? Like if that story were told to the crew, it would embarrass the captain and diminish his captainship, right? It would diminish his station. It would take away some of his leadership and authority power, which he's claimed at the point of a gun, right? And like, I'm willing to shoot you just to get you out of here. I don't want to hear about this problem. This is not the problem. The problem is what I say it is, and we're still in the problem. We haven't even gotten the damn whale yet. Like, no, we have whale oil. No, we haven't gotten the whale. It's like, right. And it's ships passing in the night. So that single-mindedness is there, that cross purposes, right? Unstated reasons, and also revealing the unstated reason, which is what you do when you say Ahab needs to worry about Ahab, not me, right? You're revealing the unstated reason. You're making it explicit. And that does, to be fair, sometimes, under the right circumstances, actually address the problem. And then he basically does an about face and says, all right, well, we'll set into port. We'll do it. We'll do what we need to do. And that doesn't seem to be, I mean, it's definitely not the result of Starbuck saying, go ahead and shoot me. This is still the right answer. It's definitely the result of him saying, you better watch out for yourself. I'll do what you say, man, but you better watch out for yourself. You may not be doing yourself any favors, even though I'll be loyal to you. And so that's very interesting because, first of all, this is what I would call real psychology, not what people refer to as psychology. And also it exemplifies the proper location to do this. It's okay to buck authority, just not publicly.
And for a sufficiently grave cause.
Both. Yep.
Yeah. Now you could tell that your analysis, there is more to it, obviously. There's always more to it. Your analysis is correct because he says to himself, there's something there. Ahab, beware of Ahab, and that gives him, I guess, a moment of clarity or something, where he can actually begin to calm down a little bit. And yeah,
Well, he stops thinking about his single-minded, unachieved goal.
mhm.
Mm.
But it's sort of like he looks at himself and actually sees himself what he's doing, and he's like, "This isn't what I want right now. This isn't actually helping somehow." Because he's, um, yeah, and Ishmael, to his credit, doesn't uh, speculate onto why exactly Ahab does the about face and does what we would consider the right thing. It may have been a flash of honesty in him, or a mere prudential policy, which, under the circumstance, imperiously forbade the slightest symptom of open disaffection, however transient, in the important chief officer of his ship. So we get two options there of how this happens, and without like a testimony of Ahab, which you still have to be careful what people say about themselves because they often don't understand themselves. Um, we don't actually know why Ahab gave the orders to go fix this thing.
Mm.
Right. It's also worth noting, it's something I only just noticed somehow, that basically that was his last, that was Starbuck's last attempt. His previous attempt was for what I would call intimacy, right? He was saying, shouldn't we get to know each other's positions better, basically?
Mhm.
And that's completely rejected, right? And dost thou then so much as dare to critically think of me? Right. I mean, it's a whopping statement. And that's when he pulls the gun. Like, how dare you critique anything I have to say or think? So his request to get to know each other's position better is completely rejected and met with threat of murder, which is just utterly fascinating. And it's not until he backs down calmly and says,
The-
Ahab, beware of thyself, old man. And then walks, basically, right. And then this is, we've heard these sorts of stories before. He waxes brave, but nevertheless obeys. Most careful bravery that. And that's when he has the moment of self-reflection was, wow, this guy's really brave. Not because he faced up to me, but because he walked out calmly.
Mm.
Which is a hint to what real bravery is, right? Real bravery is not rushing in foolishly to die. That's hoping for martyrdom, which is not going to happen, by the way. Right. Real bravery is more in the calmly handling a dangerous situation and still getting your point across.
It has to be matched with prudence.
Right.
Mm.
Well, I mean, I would argue that prudence is the bravery.
Well, yeah. Once you,
Well, foolishness
we're going to
and
get into a
bravery.
discussion about the prudence is the queen of all virtues. Under that,
Quite possibly.
yeah.
I was looking at this as well, with the fact that just in the previous chapter, Ahab makes that line saying that thrusted light is worse than presented pistols, and you do have this sort of exchange between Starbuck where there is a sort of thrusted light of like, look, this is what you're supposed to be doing as captain, and then immediately out comes the gun. It's just like there is that sort of exchange that happens, and then I was thinking about, to your point, Mark, about him kind of equating himself to like especially a nautical force of nature, that you have kind of the typhoon like raging water aspect going on, but then you have like the still water aspect of Starbuck. So there is kind of that it wasn't the light that winds up kind of making him realize his issues. It was, or even in that case, the owners standing on Nantucket Beach and out yelling him, or anything like that. It was actually the mirror, like this, him being still water was essentially a mirror for him to see himself. And that he even, not only does he do the thing, but he even mentions, he says, "Thou art too good a fellow, Starbuck." After he's gone, of course, but it's like he actually pays him a compliment after he just pulled a gun on him, for saying, "Hey, can we get to know each other's position a little better?" Which is just absolutely wild. But clearly, like, let me see. Yeah, but Ahab doesn't actually take the time to try to integrate or anything like that. Like, he recognizes that there's something there. Like, he compliments Starbuck. He says, "Okay, yeah, there is something there. Yes, I'm going to do it." What's that? He said, "Ahab, beware of Ahab. There's something there." And then he puts the musket away, but then he doesn't really think about it anymore, it seems like. And then it's just like, well, that'll be his sort of undoing, is that he keeps having these outbursts and then he kind of reels it back in, but only to just let it go another time.
No real heart seeking, no soul searching there, no repentance, I suppose, of his really rather insane project of killing a whale, a particular whale.
Right.
Who
Well, I
might be
think
God,
that's
who
important.
knows?
Yeah, there's no confession, there's no repentance, there's no penance. Right. There's just temporary sanity, which is good, but insufficient. And this is where everybody misses it, right? They're like, "Well, this is good." Yeah, but is it sufficient? Like, okay, I'll take the win, but also, like, how win is the win? Is this right? Wow, where's this going?
Like this is like step one right here. If we're going to do a 12 steps thing, right? And it's like,
There you
okay,
go.
you got to do your step 4, right? The fearless inventory. And then you got to do the step 5, tell somebody about it. And then you got to, I don't remember which step it is, go make amends for what you've done. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, that's how the healing actually happens. It's not just the little temporary flashes of insight and sanity are just going to be flashes in the pan if it's not followed up with more vigorous action to correct things.
Participation. You have to participate in your error. You can't just acknowledge it and move on. You have to participate in the error.
Yeah, I'm also kind of tying that into like him just running through these ivory legs as well, the sort of thing that it's just like he misadventures and gets stake smitten in the groin by whatever sort of thing happens, and that it's just like, I need another one. Like, it's just kind of like, all right, as soon as this one doesn't serve me well enough, like, let's just make another one, I guess.
Make one out of iron next time. Experiment with different materials.
Maybe pad it.
Wrap it in leather. Yeah.
Do something. Yeah. It's a little well, and that speaks back to the factory nature, right? Oh, we'll just get another one. Oh, we'll just make another one. Oh, we'll just, there's plenty. We'll just make another one.
All right, gentlemen. This was another insightful reading. As always, very grateful to the insights you guys brought, and unfortunately, I've got another busy Sunday next week, so we'll have to take another break. But I think after Christmas, we should be able to pick this up again. And we are actually getting there. You have read this much book. Look at how much book you've read. This much book, and not all of this is the book that we're reading. So, yeah, here we go.
Excellent. Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Guys, take care and watch out for the whales.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.